begin by cutting your cabbage into quarters and cutting the core out of each quarter. Now, if you've quartered them, it's quite easy to locate the core and remove it. Now you can slice your cabbage. Here you can see Jeff is holding the cabbage at a 45-degree angle from the blade. That means he's not cutting the flat surface, he's cutting the edge. You do that in order to get fine, wispy, uniform cuts that will ferment nicely. Here you can see that each shred comes out uniform and thin. The thinner it is, the easier it will be to ferment, and the easier it will be to get juice out of as well. So you can see the shreds are nice and fine, and you will have an occasional thick piece. All you need to do with those thick pieces is pull them out, and if the thick piece is attached to a thin piece, just break it off, keep the thin piece, and toss the thicker piece to your chickens or your compost pile, or use it in a stir fry. Now that entire pile is just one shredded head of cabbage. So do a quick go through, check to make sure it's nicely shredded, and then we're ready to add salt. In order to know how much salt to add, you need to weigh your cabbage. You want to add 19 grams of salt for every 3 pounds of cabbage. If you don't have a scale, you want to add about 3 tablespoons of salt for every 5 pounds of cabbage. So you'll need to do a little math. Then you want to place the cabbage in layers in a bowl. Begin by placing down a layer and sprinkle that layer with a small amount of salt, the salt that you have measured out. Add more cabbage and then salt another layer. When you get to the end, you'll add one final layer of cabbage and the last of your salt on top. Simply allow this to sit undisturbed for 30 minutes. This is going to draw the moisture out of the cabbage and begin making your brine. After 30 minutes, you can see that the cabbage has already reduced by about half. I'm using a wooden rolling pin here to gently pound the cabbage. You're just wanting to break up the fibers. You're not wanting to pound it until it comes to pieces. Pound it, give it a good mixing, allow it to sit a little while longer, pound it again if you need to. You're trying to get the cabbage to release its juice. When you've pounded it enough that you feel like there's enough juice to cover the cabbage, then it's time to transfer to your fermentation vessel. Here I'm using a picklet, but a harsh works well as too. Pack it into your fermentation vessel. Now here I'm using a 1.5 liter picklet, and I have 2 medium-sized heads of cabbage. You really can fit 2 full heads of cabbage into the space of about 6 cups. It compacts down a crazy amount, and don't let that throw you. Simply pack the cabbage in as best you can. Any brine that's come out, pack that in there too. Get it pressed down, and then we will begin the process of compacting it. Now here I've just added 1 head of cabbage to a 1.5 liter jar to make sure that you're able to see the process well. What we're going to do now is we're going to pack the cabbage into the jar. Place the flat side of the dunker down and the concave side up. That will give you something for your rolling pin to hold on to, and simply press. Now you can see how much the juice comes up. What we're looking to do is to get all of the air pressed out of the cabbage that we can, and to get the juice to be at least 1 inch above the top of the cabbage. Keep pressing until the cabbage is uniformly packed down. You don't see a lot of air bubbles, and the juice is at least 1 inch above. Now, I recommend for 1.5 liter that you do use 2 heads of cabbage because you want your jar to be 75% full. You want the cabbage to be about 1 inch below the shoulder, and you want the brine to be about to the shoulder of the vessel. Now here you can see I finally have that one head compacted well. You don't see many air bubbles coming up now, and you can see how much juice there is compared to the level and how little cabbage there is, how much it really packs down. Again, this is only 1 head of cabbage in a 1.5 liter picklet. Now we need to secure all the little floaties. To do that, I simply take a carrot and make peels, just carrot strips using a peeler. I take those strips and I make them into a spoke. Just like the spokes of a wheel, you just crisscross them back and forth all across the top of the jar, all touching in the center. And then when you're done, you place the dunker on top. A very gentle press, and that will secure most of the floaties below the level of the brine. Now, it's not a big deal if you do have a little bit that's floating up. It just means that it won't ferment totally on anything that's above the brine. However, it won't mold if you have the airlock installed correctly. Wet your grommet and very gently twist until the body of the airlock is sticking out the bottom of the grommet, and you can see the little holes. Latch it closed, and then place the valve into the body of the airlock. Add 1.5 tablespoons of liquid up to the fill line, and then place your cap on top. Wrap it up in a kitchen towel or place it in a dark place in order to preserve the vitamin C content. Vitamin C is light sensitive. After 36 hours, you can see that the top of the brine has gone from the shoulder of the vessel to right at the wire bales. That's only 36 hours. Now that's happening because the probiotics are producing carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide causes the vegetables to expand because the bubbles have to work their way out. Now, when they work their way out and they get to the top, the carbon dioxide is able to come out through the airlock. However, it will cause expansion, and if you have cabbage that is particularly active, it will push the brine out the airlock, and it can even push the cabbage into the airlock if you're not careful. That's why it's so important to keep the brine level to no higher than the shoulder, and keep the vegetables to no more than 1 inch below the top of the brine. Now leave your ferment on the counter for 7 to 10 days. You want to leave it out until the active bubbling stops. And then for sauerkraut, you want to transfer it to the refrigerator so that it has fermented a grand total of 10 to 12 weeks before you begin eating it. Now, you leave it on the counter to encourage the active fermentation because active fermentation takes place best at 68 to 72 degrees. However, when active fermentation is over, it is best to place it into a cooled environment. Somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees is good. The reason is that while you can leave it out, what will happen is the temperature difference will cause the cabbage to produce some flavor profiles that can be undesirable, specifically sulfur, and it can produce more alcohol than what you want. In order to discourage alcohol content and to discourage the all-flavor development, it is best to place it in an environment that is around 50 degrees. Now, for most people, that's going to have to be the refrigerator. If you have a basement works wonderfully if it stays cool enough. If you don't have the basement and you must use the refrigerator, place it in the warmest spot in your refrigerator, which is usually the bottom shelf, and keep an eye on it. If you have cool temperatures, it's perfectly fine to bring it out and leave it out in cool temperatures, but if it warms up, pop it right back in the fridge. While it doesn't happen every time, the sulfur-based compounds that can develop from warmer temperatures really just taste bad. They wreck your ferment, and your kids aren't going to be willing to eat it. So it really is best to try to keep it as cool as you can, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 degrees, once the bubbling has stopped. Now, the advice for 10 to 12 weeks is unique to sauerkraut. It's unique to any dish that contains cabbage. For other ferments, you can allow it to go until the bubbling stops, and then you can begin eating it immediately. Now, this kraut is 12 weeks old, 12 and a half weeks actually, and I'm opening it for the first time since putting it in cold storage. As you can see, it did heave up a little more after packing it down the last time, so I've got to dig a little bit to get the dunker out. And the carrots. The carrots are in there. I have to get those out too. Now, those carrots are perfectly edible, and my kids do enjoy eating them, so I have absolutely no qualms about passing those off to my kids and saying, "Here, eat it." Now, you can see the sauerkraut has held together beautifully, and it looks good. It's fermented uniformly. There aren't little unfermented clumps or little hard spots. It looks good, and it tastes good. So my daughter saw that I had pulled the sauerkraut out and that it was ready to eat, and she asked if she could have some. So I told her she could have the bowl that I had pulled out, and as you could see, she likes it. Belle regularly gets sauerkraut out of the fridge and just eats it out of a bowl with a spoon with no difficulty whatsoever. It's nothing to see her sit down and eat an entire bowl that size daily. I gave her the remote control and I walked away from the kitchen for a few minutes, and she just filmed herself eating and eating and eating. She went for another round. By the time I came back to the kitchen, she had eaten 1/4 of that 1.5 liter jar by herself. She loves it, and I'm not going to discourage her from it. As you could see, she finished the whole bowl and then went for more. Visit us at cookingtf.com for more lactofermentation videos.